the Community Homeworks workshop this evening. We're so glad that you're joining us tonight. My name is Tiana Harrison, and I'm the Education and Volunteer Coordinator at Community Homeworks. If you're watching this live, please feel free to comment and let us know where you're tuning in from. Also, if you would like to join in on the discussion or ask questions, please put that in the comment section as well. If you're watching this after the live broadcast, we're still happy to answer your questions. It just may take us a little longer to respond. Community Homeworks is a nonprofit organization with a mission to empower homeowners to maintain safe, sustainable, and dignified homes. We get our fundings from grants, gifts, and donations. So if you find value in this workshop tonight, we encourage you to donate on our website at communityhomeworks.org. Tonight's workshop is entitled Installing Trim, and our instructor is none other than the magnificent Mr. Lee Taylor. Mr. Taylor, we are so happy that you are joining us tonight, and here's Mr. Taylor.
Thanks. All right. Yeah, bear with us. This is the first time doing this class. Two in a row. That's amazing. Yeah, so this is installing trim. We have an hour, so we'll see what we can get through in that amount of time. And like Gianna said, if you're watching this and you have a question, please type it in, and hopefully I'll be able to answer it for you. What we're going to be talking about tonight is just identifying basic various types of trim and the styles, what they're made of, whether it's wood, foam, whatnot. We'll talk about how to remove that trim so that you don't damage your wall and create more work for yourself. We'll talk about installing it and some of the things to watch out for, some little tricks and whatnot. And we'll talk about like where you can get them and everything else. This workshop has a lot of related workshops. We're going to be using our compound miter saw tonight and a few other hand tools. If you're not familiar with those, you can come on down, right, and take our power tools class or our hand tools class, or you can watch it online. So I'm not really going to get into details with this. And it also kind of works well with other classes as far as common door repairs, wood window repairs, flooring, wall repairs, and many others. So, we're talking about not necessarily trimming out a whole house. We're talking about, let's say you have a door that has damaged trim on it, or you put a new window in, or something along that line, and you want to be able to trim it out. Part of what you're going to want to do is to get an idea of what style trim you have. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of different styles out there. I don't know if you guys can see this real close, or maybe I'll use this guy right here, right? So I'm going to talk about base trim, what runs along the bottom of the wall, up against your floor. You have multiple styles. I mean, these are just two different styles here. This is colonial style. This is like a ranch style. And, in a lot of the older homes, you're going to have even much taller base. So base trim basically runs around the base of your walls. And then you have what's also called casing, or some people call it window trim, door trim. That's what goes around any doors or windows. And that can be items like this right here is a stick of, and this is something I'm going to knock off. This is your colonial style casing trim. So the issue with this is that usually it's usually not a good idea to mix trim. And what I'm getting into with that is, let's say you have a door, and let's say for some reason, you guys can see me over here still. Let's say for some reason, one side was damaged. So you're going to get in there and pull that trim off and replace it. If you do that, we're going to talk about how to pull it off so that you don't break it. You want to be able to take that piece of trim, or at least cut off a piece of that trim, to be able to find the identical profile. Because, like I said, with different style trims, you have different profiles, and you also have different thicknesses. I don't care if it's base trim or casing or anything along that line. So it can be tricky sometimes, especially when you get into some of these older homes, and even some of the new ones. So, like I said, you want to be able to match that trim up. Either that, or what you're going to be doing is replacing the whole, say, window or door itself. There's nothing worse than, saying, oh, I have colonial style trim, and going to the store and picking one up and then coming back, and not only are the thicknesses different, but the profile is different. So save a few trips. So kind of really watch that. And if you have older homes, sometimes going to what am I thinking? Yeah, salvage yard. Thank you. Where they go in and they'll pull out old trim and whatnot out of older homes and then sell it at various lengths and whatnot. Sometimes that is the easiest way to be able to find those, especially if you're trying to keep, say, the integrity of the home, that sort of thing. Then you get into whether that trim is painted or whether that trim is just natural, stained, or just polyurethane or something along that line. I would say that if you are just beginning with this, stay with painted trim for now. If you need practice, you can always build a frame out of 2x4s and use that as your kind of a practice session. And we'll talk about that a little bit more also. As far as we'll talk about removing that trim. So let's say you have your door here and it's got a piece of casing trim on it. Let's say it's attached, right? And this is your wall surface right here. You want to be really gentle. One of the first things you're going to want to do is get a utility knife. And what you're doing is you're actually cutting. I'm going to do this way. And I think you can see it on here. I'm going to just use this as. So let's say this is your wall, and this is your trim here. A lot of times this has been caulked over the years, or even paint, heavy paint, that sort of thing. So what you want to do is go through and with a nice sharp utility knife, just gently score it, so that when you pull that trim off, depending on what kind of wall surface you have, and it's usually drywall, that's the issue. You can pull that trim off and it will actually tear the paper on that drywall. And then that creates just more work. So by cutting that, but lightly cutting through that caulk or heavy paint or anything along that line, you want to do that first. Then what you're going to want to do, and you can't see this, but you're going to start at the, I'm talking a door, say. You're going to want to start at the bottom. And what you're going to do is you're going to work in a relatively thin flat bar. Sometimes you're going to want to have a scrap piece of wood or something like that to be able to protect your wall. And you're just gently going to get in there and lift it up a little bit. Don't think you need to fully release it. And once I do that, I flip this over and I get this part here. And what I'll do is I'll actually rock it so that it just works, work my way up and just make it so that trim is coming off. Again, keeping something behind that wall or protecting that wall. And two, you want to move slow. So if you notice that it's starting to say, tear the drywall or something along that line, you can get your utility knife and rescore that area so that it's not damaging your walls as you're pulling that trim off. And you work your way up. So in this case here, start at the bottom, and you're going to work your way up. You're working on the wall side. I don't like working on the jamb side because when you're prying it, you can put little dents in your frame of your window or your door or whatever. And that's a whole other thing you don't want to get into. So I work my way up. And what people are tempted to do is when they get close to the top, the bottom may be released and they just want to go ahead and pull it off. You don't want to necessarily do that because, and here's a piece right here that will show why. A lot of times when these are mitered together, that's with you have a 45-degree angle and you have another piece coming off at a 90-degree. When they do that, a lot of times, they will drive a nail through those two miters to help keep it closed up. So you can see how this one would have been nailed into the piece that was heading this way. So if you just go ahead and go and pull it, you can damage that trim. Sometimes it doesn't really matter, but it's something to keep in mind. Oh. So now you're going to have this, you're going to have your trim with all the nails sticking through it and everything else. And I don't see the thing I want. So I'm going to set this aside. Oh, it's a pair of pliers, channel locks, or something along that line. This is a step that you can use. Thank you. This is a step that you can use if you want to save the trim. If you don't want to save it, you can just pound them out, do whatever you want, bend them over. But if you do want to save that trim for some reason, what you can do is, I don't know if you can necessarily see this. I'm going to use my adjustable pliers. I'm going to grab it like this, and I have this curved edge here. What I'm going to do is grab it and just roll it, and I'm actually pulling that trim or those nails from the back side of that, and then I can go ahead and clean this off. And then that way it's not blowing out the face. And we had talked about this in some of the other classes also. So removing those nails, that way it makes life a lot easier, especially if you're trying to be able to save that piece of trim for whatever reason. Now, as far as the actual process, we'll go back to this door. So if you're just removing one piece, we talked about, going out and making sure that that new piece is going to match up. If you can't find those a matching piece of trim for whatever reason, and it happens more often than you'd think, you're going to have to go ahead and remove all that trim from that particular door or window and then be able to install new or used or whatever, something that is going to work in that room. So you can see with this one here, this is a door frame that had trim on it. And you can see from the old paint line here, this is what's called a reveal. So this is and it varies. Like I said, how much of that you're going to actually see. And I'll get a piece of, I'll get a smaller piece right here. How much you're going to actually see depends. Some people, when they put that trim on, they like a very, very small reveal right here, like maybe 1/8 of an inch. Sometimes it's a little bit wider. I'm going to pick on doors real quick first. Sometimes the door itself is going to tell you how it wants to be trimmed out or what that reveal is going to be. And we got a post right in the way, maybe. So I'm going to say with a door, What I like to do is, especially if you have hinges and say it's an in-swing door and you're working around your hinges, if that trim is installed tight up against your hinge, the hinge is going to rub more often than not. So a lot of times what the people will do is they will back off of that hinge, a heavy eighth of an inch, something along that line, so that it doesn't rub. And then that is what's going to sometimes determine what your reveal is going to be. So I would say that's going to be your first thing you're going to want to do, is figure out how far away that how much reveal there is going to actually be. And what you can do at that point is get your pencil and go ahead and you say, all right, I think it's going to be this much. I'm going to go ahead and I'll put my mark, right? And then you can say, you can get your tape measure, and you can say, that gives me about a 1/4 inch reveal. All right? Keeping that in mind, what you can do is you can go around and mark from the inside of your frame up 1/4 inch, give yourself a mark, and you want to give yourself a couple of different marks. The reason is that when you install that trim, you want to be able to, you can move that trim a little bit. So back to, let's say we're putting this on, I'm going to get it to that mark. I'm going to tack it in. We'll talk about that in a second. But then I can move it in or out so that reveal is consistent and you don't have, no reveal and you don't have too large of a reveal. So having a couple of marks on that frame, whether it's a window or a door, makes it so that you can get that nice reveal. And believe me, trim is one of those things you have to play with. You have to do to learn it. The other thing is that if you have an old door and it has a bunch of paint buildup and stuff, sometimes you can just match it right back up to that old paint buildup or something. If you want to do that, that's fine. Some people will go through and want to clean this off. That's all right, but you do have to keep in mind, if you're working especially in an older house, that you may be disturbing lead paint. So that is one of those things you have to kind of keep in mind with that also. So the reveal is pretty important. Now, as far as how you do it, well, there are a lot of different ways to be able to do it. If you are going to be using, say, hand nails, you can buy various sizes of hand nails. These are 4Ds. And what they are is about 1.5 inches. These are 6Ds. These are a hair longer. I'll bring them right over here to show you. So you have a variety of, I don't know if you can see those there or not. You have a variety of length of nails here. Move these that way. So depending on what you're getting into, because when you're nailing these in, you are going to be going into the frame of whatever it is that you're trimming. And you're also going to be going into the wall or the studs that are behind this. So depending on how thick your wall is, I said plaster walls can be a lot thicker sometimes. You may need to get a little bit longer nail. And these, like I said, these are hand nailing, where you'd need your hammer and you'd need a good old nail set, that sort of thing. So you can also use pneumatic tools. I'm not going to hook them up. If you are using kind of air power tools or battery operated trim nailers. Two sizes basically you're going to be dealing with. This one, you may not be able to see it. This is a 16 gauge. This would be the equivalent of a larger nail like this. They look a little different. I'll show you how they look over here. But 16 gauges are going to be for, or the bigger nails are going to be for what's up against your wall. The small nails, say like this, but in this version, and they may not even be in there, but yeah, they are. You can see these. These are 18 gauge nails, and they're much smaller, thinner, less likely to split. And what those are made for is to go through your trim into the frame of your window or your door or whatever. So you don't want to necessarily use the bigger nails to go into your frame. The reason is you're going to split it out most of the time. As far as using these, that's another class, right? But like I said, hand nailing or pneumatic nailing is a nice way to be able to do that, to be able to attach those. And it's really about the only way. I'm going to have this. Do you have one of these online already, or no? Okay. You have, when you are putting in your casing, say around your window or your door, we talked about marking out how much of a reveal you're going to have and all this sort of stuff. Make sure you have plenty of marks. You want to think about, you want to have that mark way up here and way over here. The reason for that, and this is not quite right, but what you do is you're going to cut your 45-degree angle, and I'm going to get it right to that mark. You can see that I need about 3 more hands. You can see that the short point of this 45, I put it right at that mark. And this is where it's nice if you have somebody to help you to be able to hold it, because then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, yeah, that'd be great. So what you can do is you can hold that right to that mark right there at this point. We're going to move it up so that we're at our right reveal right there. I'm going to get this up to where that reveal is. I know I'm clicking on it. Picking on me. So let's say that's that mark right there. I'm going to put this mark, and I'll draw a line roughly of what way it needs to go. And I'll say that's a 45 right there. Thank you. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to lay this on. I'm going to put this at a 45-degree angle. Cut. And I'm showing you with the chop saw. You can do it with a hand miter, just a box miter saw like that. Now, I don't know if you can see this right here quite good enough. Here's my mark right here, but the issue is you're going to start cutting here. Now, there's a couple things you can do especially if you're not quite used to doing this. What some people will do is they'll get a speed square, and they'll go from that mark. This angle here is a 45-degree, and they'll just draw it right out. And at least get something out to this fatter part. Because, again, that fatter part is going to be what's further away. What I like to do, and you probably can't see that from here. I'll turn this a little bit. Can I move this? And maybe. All right. So this is my mark right here. It is a little hard to see. you don't want to cut right on that mark right away. So what you're going to want to do is work into it. So I just do a dry fit like this. My blade is about, quarter inch away. Start it up. And you can see how I kind of worked my way into that point. It just makes it so that you're less likely to have to recut another piece and makes your life a little easier. So again, me personally, I like putting the top piece on. So what you would do is you'd line your marks back up, you'd look at it, you'd say, yep, that looks about right. What I would do at this point would be to put one larger nail in, whether you're shooting it in or nailing it in, doesn't really matter. I like to put one in here and one here, as long as this hasn't shifted one way or the other. I can't really nail it, but so, you just make sure it's in good shape. You put your nail in, you leave that nail head sticking out for now. Little trick you want to think about, especially if you have a profiled style trim like this, is where you put your nails. You see this one has little grooves here, a little groove here. I don't like putting my nails right in there. It just makes filling them and whatnot later a pain. So I usually try to find a flat area where I'm going to be putting that nail in. And again, I'm not worried about nailing into that door frame yet. So I get this top one up, and then what I can do at that point is I can take my measurement from this far point here, or this far point here, all the way down to your finished floor. This can vary a little bit. If you're going on to some kind of a hard surface, you want to be pretty accurate as far as your length goes. If you're going to something like carpet or something along that line where you can kind of bury it a little bit and hide that little bit of a gap, then it's not quite as crucial. But I'll take my measurement from that far point all the way down to where I want it, mark that onto my trim, and then go ahead and do your 90-degree cut on it. If you are not sure, usually what I'll say is cut it long. You can always come back and trim it off. So, how are you going to know if that's cut long? I will need your hand right now then. Thank you. I'll hold that guy up there. So let's say I put that in and it's, it's overlap like that. Well, obviously, yeah, that's too long. What you can do is you can just kind of match that up. And when you're putting this trim in, I'm always looking at that profile. I want it to match here and here. There's other little issues. Sometimes your wall tips or tips. So what you'll end up with is, I want to hold it down here. What you'll end up with are two pieces of trim that are, I'm going to use these, rocking. I'm going to use this one here to show that. I'm using the wrong side. There it is. I'm still using the wrong side. It's been a day. Here it is. I'm going to have to recut this guy. Hold up. All right. So ideally, when these are together, you can see that it's not gapped like this. It's not gapped like this. And you also want to think about that one piece is not doing this or this, you know. So what I do a lot of times when I'm putting these together and I dry fit them, I'm going to check right here. I'm going to also run my hand this way. And what I'm feeling for is whether those are being offset this way. If they are, let's say for some reason it is, and let's say for some reason it's tilted in, sometimes what you can do is you can cheat. You can get a little shim or something along that line. Even a piece of cardboard sometimes is all it needs. And put it in back behind the trim, up against the wall. And what that's going to do is help rotate that trim up, or this trim up, so that they flush out. Now, in an ideal world, that's perfect. Everything looks good. This is 245s, 90-degree corner. Sometimes that's not always the case. Sometimes what happens is you end up with kind of an open miter like that. Sometimes what people will do with that one is they will cut this back just a little bit, and some people will just do it with a utility knife or something along that line. It's because what's happening is sometimes these inside pieces butt up to each other, and it can make it so that it just doesn't want to line up. So sometimes all you need to do is just get a nice sharp utility knife and trim that off. Yes, you can do it on a chop saw, but sometimes it's not necessarily worth it. And sometimes that's all you need to be able to do that, to be able to make those fit tight. Usually what happens is when you are, let's say you're putting this piece up, right? I'll need your hand again, Jason. Sorry. So let's say you're putting this piece up. You have this one up here that's tacked. And you're going ahead and you're putting this one in. I'm going to hold that guy right there. So this is why I say I want this one attached pretty good. Is that as you're going along, if I'm moving this, say I move it this way, the bottom starts to open up, or I move it this way, that top starts opening up. I'm always keeping an eye on that as far as how close that fit is. You know, ideally you don't want much of a gap at all. If you're finding that for some reason it's drifting one way or the other, double check your marks that you did, or you may have an issue where, you may have an issue with what you're dealing with may not necessarily be square. So this is where a framing square or something else comes in line like this. You can hold it right up there, and sometimes you'll realize that the frame of the door or the window is a little bit cocked one way or the other. And this is where it can get a little maddening, or a lot maddening. If that's the case, and let's say this is trim that you're not going to be painting, well, then you have to start playing around with your angles. You know, it may be you need to do a 44.5 instead of a 45, or something along that line. So this is where he said have a little extra trim, and you can start playing around with that to be able to figure out if you have kind of an out of square corner that you're trying to work with. And that one is just practice. In an ideal world, 45s work, but we don't live in an ideal world half the time. So, like I said, as far as trimming that out, you're going to be, you know, if you're happy with all the miters and everything else and you're good, and it doesn't look like it's going to be needing to be adjusted whatsoever, some people, what they'll do is at that point, they'll get a little wood glue, something like this, squirt a little on there, and make it so that when they mush them together, that wood glue will squirt out. It'll help keep that together. And then they're finished nailing this off. And then they're going to get a small nail or the 18 gauge nailer. And they'll either nail in from the top down, pinning these two together. You don't want to get too close to the edge, so usually I'll back it off about an inch or so and nail that in, or from the side. It just depends. There's no real right or wrong way. It's usually what you can reach. There is a little safety issue that you have to think about with that. Not so much with hand nailing, but with power nailing, is a lot of people will hold it right at this point, and they'll shoot that nail in, or they'll shoot that nail in. And the issue is that depending on how that wood is, I've seen that nail. I'm going to pick on somebody that they're probably not watching, but what they were doing something like this, and they shot that trim nail in, and the trim nail shot out, went through this finger, underneath this finger, and through this finger. And they were sitting there going, ugh, because it just found a hard spot in the wood and went firing out. So beware of things like that. Usually, especially if you're nervous about something like that, you can use something else to hold it, or keep your fingers way back so that even if that nail does come shooting out, it's going to miss. So, because that was a trip to the ER and them sitting there like this for a while until the doctor came and and pulled that out. So, yeah, trim can get you. Like I said, it's a practice type thing, and believe me, it's one of those things that it takes a while. And even people that do trim all the time, they're going to have open miters. They're going to have, different things that they're going to have to deal with. Sometimes what happens is the frame, let's say your frame of whatever it is that you're trimming, it may be offset. And what I mean by that is, let's say that's your wall, right? And let's say this is your frame. What happens is that one is offset from the other. One is further out or further in. That can be really difficult, because what's going to happen is that trim is going to sit there and rock back and forth. So, a couple little things that you can do. I'm going to knock into this. Is usually what happens is for some reason the whatever the wall is, drywall or plaster or something along that line, is pushed out. And you don't necessarily want to leave it like that, because what's going to happen is you're going to have a gap right here. So a little trick some people will do is they'll put their trim up dry without nailing it. They'll do a light mark with a pencil. And what they'll do is they'll get a utility knife or even a hammer. And what they'll do is on the inside where that drywall is pushed out, they'll either scrape it off with a chisel or mush it down with a hammer or something like that. And basically all it's doing is mushing that in so that when that trim sits, it's going to sit up against your frame. But not so much where you're going to see it past that point. That's why you want to make that mark. So there are always little tricks that you can do. Like I said, YouTube's a great place to be able to go, especially if you run into some kind of an issue, and you can put that in and you'll see 50 different ways to be able to go after it. So sometimes you're going to have issues where it is, how much time do we have? Okay. Sometimes you have issues where it is really set back. Let's say it's set back a half inch or 3/4 of an inch or something along that line. I've had that where what I end up having to do is I'll go out and buy pine or something along that line and rip it down to the thickness that I want, and I'll actually apply that. What I'm doing is actually bringing that frame out, so then I can put my I can put my casing on to be able to match that up so that, I'm bringing this whole frame, in a sense, out. That's a whole other can of worms, but it's doable. We have a kitchen window that's very much like that.
Lee, we do have a couple questions, and I don't know if
cool.
you can help us with these or not. Dorothy Jordan says, if you're able, I would love to see how you remove old quarter round
Okay.
and cut new. The trim is in the upstairs of my old house.
Okay.
Dorothy also did another question a little bit later where she said she'd like to see a demonstration of how to remove old quarter round without damaging it.
Woohoo. Okay. Do I need to repeat that question, or
No, you
okay.
shouldn't need to because
Good.
it came across the mic.
So what they're talking of quarter round. Let me just take a piece of this real quick. You don't need to return this, do you? Cool. So, I don't know if you can see this. Let's say this is our base trim. This is quarter round that's going in. It's usually what it's meant to do is hide a gap or something along that line. And yeah, sometimes that gets damaged. It can be a real bear to get that quarter round off, because what they do is they'll get nails and they'll nail this in at an angle like this. And sometimes they're nailing into the trim itself, or sometimes they're nailing into the floor. It just sort of depends, or both. As far as getting that off, it's, again, you've heard me talk about those really, really thin putty knives, or something along that line. Like I said, this one's a little thick versus this guy. So what I'm going to do is generally I'm going to start on one end or the other. I'm going to very gently get in there and just rock it a little bit, because usually the nails that are holding that on are relatively small most of the time. And once you get that open, the same rules apply. You got to get your knife, score it, all that good stuff, because, again, especially if it's painted or something along that line. And, yeah, you just got to get in there and get it started and just be very, very, very gentle. The older it is, the more brittle it most likely is. And, so sometimes those sticks can be really long. So, yeah, you just have to kind of keep working it. And what I'll do at that point is I'll work it out to where I feel that nail has released. And then I'll move down the line. Trick with that is if you're going up against your base trim, you have to be careful that you're not marring that trim up. So if that's the case, put something, piece of cardboard, something along that line that's going to help protect that base trim so you're not having to go back and fix that. Hopefully that answers your question.
Dorothy mentioned that she wanted to remove the quarter round so that she could remove the layers of paint. So I'm guessing that it's also painted in place, which is always a fun
Yeah,
project.
and again, with the whole paint thing, you got to watch it as far as, that lead. And, it's a good possibility it's lead paint. And by disturbing it, you're getting into a mess. I guess if you're having to, I guess I'm not clear on the question as far as she needs to remove the quarter round, but just the quarter round. She doesn't need to remove the base.
I think it was two separate questions. She asked about removing quarter round without damaging it so she
Right.
could try to remove the paint. But then she also asked about removing old quarter round and cutting new quarter round to replace it.
Okay. Yeah, that's it's difficult. It really is. Like I said, the older that stuff is, the more apt it is to be able to break. So just real gentle. But, I mean, before I'd even tackle that, I would find a little piece. A lot of times, that base trim is going to be going around, and you may have, a small little wall where you have a small piece like this. You can gently pop that off, go out and make sure you can find that particular profile, because again, the distance here and the distance here can vary. So I would, before I would get into that project, I would take a little piece and go maybe to, if you're lucky, you might be able to find it at the box stores. You may have to go to one of those. We said it before. It's been a long day. Yeah, that place where they go in and they recycle all the old trim and everything else. Boy, my brain's really gone. That's bad. Anyways, to be able to make sure that you can find that, especially if you're going to be matching pieces up and whatnot. So, I do want to talk about base trim. Base trim is a little bit easier. When you're putting base trim in, again, most of the same rules apply as far as profiles, thickness, all that sort of stuff. So you want to kind of keep that in mind. Same rules apply as far as if you want to remove it. Here's your wall. You're going to get in there and cut that, caulk or whatever, paint and whatnot. Same rules. Protect your wall, get in, move it out, pull that off. Same deal with pulling the trim out or the nails out, that sort of stuff. As far as installing it, there are multiple ways to be able to install it. Some people will do just a 45 corner like this and another 45 corner and just put them right in together. I don't have another one cut at a 45 because I don't know why. That can be all right, especially if it's going to be painted. You can always use a painter's caulk or something along that line, like this guy here. That's, you can work that in, but it needs to be painted over. So, painted trim is a little more forgiving. You can also do what's called coping. And this one, I started to cope, and I'll finish this off real quick, and I'm kind of backwards, so. And what you're doing is you're cutting this at a back angle. And I'll finish this off real quick. And this one's one of these things that, and I did it really bad, but you can see my piece. And what I did is I back cut that a little bit. And the idea is that you're going to have your other, I'm trying to figure out how best to show this. You're going to have your other piece of trim, and you want it to butt right in. But if you look at this, you're going to notice that I goofed up here. There's a gap here. This is all fuzzy and whatnot. It's not a straight line. What some people will do is they'll flip this, and with this style trim, they'll turn this saw a little bit just so you have a little bit of an angle, and they'll cut down to this point, and then they'll use the coping saw for this angle cut right here. What other people will do is they will just do it all by hand. What you can do is keep a little piece of that same trim, and I wrap it with a little bit of sandpaper, and I'm keeping them at the same plane, and I'm not doing this in the right way so that you can see it. But I got my piece right here. I'm going to keep it flat on the table, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that sandpaper to kind of clean that up, and I'm keeping them both flat on this work surface. And as long as you didn't go way off kilter like I did here, which is really bad, it will clean that up. And it will make it so that when you put that new piece in, it's going to match up a lot better. And you're not going to have that much of a gap and whatnot. So, like I said, coping is a whole other set of skills. We all need coping skills, right? So, this is, like I said, this is a nice way to do it, especially if you're dealing with trim where it is not going to be painted or something along that line. It's going to give you a nice, tight corner versus maybe a 45. And the issue with that is you have inside corners and you have outside corners. And the issue is that your outside corner or even your inside corner, it may be flared out. It may not be a 90-degree angle. It may be flared in. Usually it's flared out because when they get to an outside, there's extra drywall mud, which makes that not a 90, it flares it out. So, sometimes what's happening is when you go to put them together on an outside corner, you have this huge gap, and you may have to go back to your saw and adjust that cut. So, and we talk about this in power tools class as far as there are some chop saws out there, compound miter saws, that go up to, 47, 48 degrees. You can see that kind of. And, sometimes you have to open it up a little bit or close it up a little bit. So this is where you, understanding your saw and how it works helps out with all that sort of stuff. The other things you can do is you can use, you can cheat. Inside corners, I did this. They come in all different styles and shapes and whatnot. I did this in our room. It actually worked out really nice. You put this right into the corner. You shoot a couple nails into it, pop, 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 pop. And then this is not quite right because this is a little taller. Then you just butt your trim right up. And you butt your trim right up. And that makes it so that you're not having to do those complicated cuts. So that sometimes these inside corners make life a little bit easier. You can't even do it on an outside corner. Sometimes there's a little notch out of the backside that will fit right on an outside corner, and you can shoot it in, and then just have your straight 90-degree cuts button into it. So like I said, there's a lot of tricks you can do. Some of the older houses get into, I don't think we have that trim, get into the multiple pieces of trim. That one, I don't think we have time to get to necessarily, and we're talking just basic trim right here. But just realize if you have that older house and you have that flat trim, and it may be 3 or 4 pieces. You may have a piece like this on the top where the trim butts up to it and then runs off this way. You may have a little piece underneath, that's running along. So there's a lot of different styles out there, and you may have to do a little research as far as how those are put in. When you're putting in base trim, and I'm quickly running out of time. When you're putting in base trim, what you're going to want to do is, again, let's say this is your wall. I'm going to use the stud finder, and I'm going to go through, and I'm going to mark, say, yep, there's a stud there, yep, there's a stud here, right? And you want to actually nail into that stud. So what you're going to do is, you don't want to get it too close to the edge. Usually I'll use 2 for a trim like this. It's about 3 inches wide. Sometimes you may need a few more nails depending on how tall your trim is. What you're doing is you're running that nail in and you're actually nailing into the stud. That's going to make it so that when you're looking at it, I don't have a good way to do this. When you're looking at it, there's less gaps between the top of your trim, top of your base trim, and the wall. Now, there are always variations. Your wall is not necessarily flat. Your trim can bend depending on what style it is a little bit, but sometimes you're going to have gaps. And again, that's where painted trim is nice. You can just go ahead and caulk that and then paint over it and you're good. But again, if you're doing unfinished trim or polyurethane or something along that line or stained, those issues become a little more apparent. But, you're driving in 2 nails into those studs as much as you can. And then you can put on your accent pieces, whether it's quarter round and whatnot. Trim can be made out of a whole bunch of different things. Everybody knows about wood trim. A lot of times these pre-primed wood trims, I'm going to go over about 5 minutes, so a lot of times these pre-primed trims are what are called finger joint trims, so they're scrap pieces. And I don't know if you can really see this. it's basically what they call finger joining. They just use little scrap pieces of wood, and they glue them together to make your trim. That's part of the reason that they're pre-primed. Versus, say, like your good pine trim or oak or whatever, where you're going to spend a lot more because they can't join them together. Sometimes you have different composite materials. Sometimes you can have trim that is made out of foam. You can have trim that's made out of particle board. You have trim that's made out of PVC. This is something that's going to fall on my head. This is actually a PVC. No, it's not. This is just a pre-prime, but they do sell PVC out there. This is like a press board, particle board style. You want to think about where you're installing that trim. The reason is, let's say, like a high moisture area, bathroom, kitchen, something along that line. If you're going to be putting in, say, a pressed style board trim, yes, it's going to be cheaper, all that good stuff. But what's going to happen is that a lot of times if it gets wet, it's just going to puff up. And it's going to look really bad. It's going to turn all your work that you've done for a while and make it look horrible. This is sometimes where people use, like in high moisture environments, they may use like a PVC style trim or even a foam style trim. And like I said, there's a lot of different styles out there. But if you're in a high moisture area, you may want to use a trim that's not going to react to water. So, like I said, lots of different style trims out there. Lots of ways to be able to dress it up. You know, I've seen it where people will get, a trim like this, and they'll install it, your base trim, and then they may get, a piece of quarter round or shoe and run it along the bottom. Sometimes I've seen them where they put something else on top to be able to dress that out a little bit. And so like I said, sometimes you can add different layers of trim. You can be creative sometimes as long as it's appealing for you and it works out, great. So as far as finishing them off, simple enough. We talked about these hand nails. When you're happy with everything, you go ahead and you nail them in. You don't want to, when you're hammering those guys in, what I'll do is I will leave it. If I'm nailing this in, I'm going to leave it out. And I can't figure out a good way to do this. I'm going to leave that head out about that much, just a little bit. And then what I can do is I can come in with my nail set, put that right on there, and go ahead and hit it with the hammer and sink that nail and countersink it so that either I can put a putty in it or whatever. You don't want hammer marks, and you can't really see it, but boy, it will mess you up. So, a lot of times when you're hammering these in, be gentle with that hammer and don't really pound it because you'll end up with these dents and things, and it just looks horrible. So, like I said, practice. If you really want to really get a good practice on it, get a set of 2x4s and you can screw them together and make a box, and then you can practice nailing those in and trimming out that box to give you a little better feel for it. Either that or you buy extra trim so that when you miscut something or whatever, you have that extra piece to be able to do that. I've gone 5 minutes over. Is there any other questions? No? Okay. Well, thanks for watching. Hopefully you will come out and be able to do a little more on the hand-on part of these classes.
just wanted to thank everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
I was not happy with that. For me, personally.